Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. Now let's begin. Imagine living in a castle with soaring towers, endless feasts, roaring fires, and servants waiting on you hand and foot. Sounds like a dream, right? The ultimate medieval fantasy. But now, strip away the romantic glow and step into the real world of medieval wealth. Because behind those thick stone walls, life wasn't just uncomfortable. It could be downright terrifying. It was the constant, gnawing fear. Fear of losing everything you'd built. Fear that your heirs would fight over your corpse. From courtly intrigue and family treachery to poisoned wine and deadly inheritance games, you'll see why being rich wasn't the dream, it was the nightmare. This isn't the Middle Ages you learned about in fairy tales. This is the raw, brutal, and often horrifying reality of what it really meant to be rich when the world was ruled by swords, superstition, and suspicion. Fine clothes, grand feasts, servants to wait on you hand and foot, and a castle to call your own. But peel back the polished surface of wealth in the Middle Ages, and you'll uncover a harsh truth. Being rich didn't just make life more luxurious, it made it more dangerous. You weren't just wealthy, you were a walking target. A glittering bullseye for thieves, enemies, rebels, and even your own supposed friends. Fear that your closest ally would betray you for a title or a land grant. Fear that one whisper from a jealous rival would send the church or the crown knocking at your door. If you think being rich in the Middle Ages meant luxury, ease, and power, think again. The truth is, it often meant paranoia, betrayal, and danger lurking around every corner. In the medieval world, wealth didn't buy you peace. It bought you enemies. It made you a target. It turned your own family into potential threats, and your so-called friends into opportunists. One misstep at court could make the king turn against you. Give too much gold to the wrong church, and you'd be branded a heretic. Build a castle too grand, and people would say you were trying to outshine the crown. You had to walk a tightrope every single day, and one wrong move could cost you everything. Your servants might be spies, your neighbors might want your land, and your relatives, your own blood, might be plotting to poison you at the banquet table. Sure, you had a bed, but it was lumpy and infested. You had food, but it was drenched in spices to cover the taste of rot. You had clothes, but they were heavy, itchy, and far from clean. There was no privacy, no toothpaste, no medicine that worked. And while you might have servants, they saw everything and they talked. The richer you were, the sharper the knives around you. Being wealthy wasn't about relaxing. It was about performing. Every word you spoke could be twisted into treason. And let's not forget, comfort was relative. But what really made being rich in medieval times so awful wasn't just the bad food or backstabbing politics. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on the fantasy of medieval wealth and exposing the harsh truth. So buckle up, because the worst thing about being rich in medieval times? It might not be what you expect. You were a walking target. It sounds enviable, doesn't it? To be rich in the medieval world. Fine clothes, grand feasts, servants to wait on you hand and foot, and a castle to call your own. But peel back the polished surface of wealth in the Middle Ages. Just traveling down a country road could feel like a gamble. If you were rich, people didn't always kill you right away. They ransomed you. Noble prisoners were essentially walking treasure chests. A knight or lord could be worth a fortune in gold. You were never truly safe. Politics in the medieval world were like walking through a minefield. One poorly chosen word at court, one rumor whispered into the wrong ear, and you could find yourself accused of treason or heresy. Your lands could be seized, your name smeared, Suddenly you're expected to fund half the town's needs. Give too little, and you're stingy. Give too much, and you inspire jealousy or suspicion. There was no winning. You were either a miser or a fool. And people always found ways to whisper about how you got your fortune in the first place. Were your ancestors slavers? Thieves? Did you swindle peasants out of their land? The past had a way of haunting the rich, especially if you couldn't defend yourself from the gossip, and your head placed on the chopping block, all because you had something someone else wanted. And make no mistake, if you were rich, everyone wanted what you had. It was common practice in warfare. Capture a noble, send a polite letter to their family, and wait for a chest of coins to arrive. Every famine, every unfair tax you collected as a lord drove them one step closer to rebellion. And when rebellions broke out, as they sometimes did, they went straight for the manor houses. Rich lords and their families were dragged out, sometimes slaughtered in the streets, their estates looted and burned. You might be feared, but that didn't mean you were respected. To the hungry and desperate, your wealth was both a symbol of power and an excuse for violence. Sometimes that chest never came, or your enemies used the opportunity to eliminate you quietly. The church added its own layer of pressure. It wasn't enough to be wealthy. You had to appear pious and generous, or face the consequences. The church was powerful, and its definition of sin conveniently evolved to fit the needs of the day. Were you charging interest? That was usury. Were your feasts too extravagant? That was gluttony. Were your clothes too fine? Vanity. Your wealth could be interpreted as a sign of divine favor or damning evidence of moral corruption. And if the wrong priest had a grudge, your soul might be condemned before you even had a chance to defend yourself. In either case, your riches didn't protect you, they only prolonged the pain. Bandits weren't picky, but if you were decked out in fur-lined cloaks, jeweled belts, and silk hose, you were basically announcing to the world, "Come rob me." You didn't have to be alone either. A small personal guard was often no match for a determined gang of outlaws, especially in areas where law enforcement was laughably thin. In fact, some guards were happy to switch sides if the right purse was waved in front of them. And you'll uncover a harsh truth. Being rich didn't just make life more luxurious, it made it more dangerous. You weren't just wealthy, you were a walking target. A glittering bullseye for thieves, enemies, rebels, and even your own supposed friends. Your problems began the moment you stepped out of your manor. And let's not forget how valuable you were even after capture. You weren't just vulnerable on the battlefield or the road. Your own household could be a nest of danger. Servants were necessary, but trust was a luxury you couldn't afford. Poisoning wasn't just a plot device in Shakespeare, it was a real and terrifying risk. A disgruntled cook, an ambitious steward, or even a family member might slip something deadly into your wine goblet. Power struggles within noble families were bloody and merciless. Brothers turned on brothers, sons betrayed fathers, wives plotted against husbands. Why? Because inheritance meant everything in wealth didn't pass peacefully from one hand to the next, even outside your immediate circle. Then there were the peasants. While many accepted their place in the feudal system, resentment simmered just beneath the surface. Every harsh winter, of course, even when you tried to use your wealth for good, it could backfire. Building a hospital or a monastery, suddenly you're expected to fund half the town's needs. Give too little, and you're stingy. Give too much, and you inspire jealousy or suspicion. We're a battleground of ambition and treachery. If you were wealthy, your wealth demanded that you maintain an army, keep up appearances, arrange strategic marriages, bribe the right people, and squash dissent before it could bloom. You had to be cunning, ruthless, and always one step ahead. Any lapse in vigilance could mean ruin or death. Your marriage wasn't about love, it was a transaction. One generation of mismanagement, and your family could be thrown from luxury into poverty. But it also meant your life was lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by threats from without and within. Your wealth made you powerful, but it also made you vulnerable. And in a world where power shifted like sand and loyalty could be bought for a coin, that vulnerability could prove fatal. In the end, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't the pressure, the politics, or the paranoia. It was the fact that you could never stop looking over your shoulder. Because someone, somewhere, always wanted what you had. Every smile might hide a dagger. Every invitation might be a trap. You could never truly relax, never truly trust, and never truly feel safe. In the medieval world, gold didn't just buy luxury, it bought enemies. Riches didn't guarantee permanence, they only raised the stakes. Inheritance, these were the true stakes. Rich daughters were married off to older men for political gain, and rich sons were expected to marry strategically, even if it meant tying themselves to unpleasant or even dangerous families. And if you were an heiress, God help you. You were a prize to be seized. Some noblewomen were kidnapped and forced into marriage by ambitious men who wanted a shortcut to power. Your wealth didn't shield you, it put a target on your back. There was no winning. Being rich meant you were squeezed for every penny the crown could extract. Kings were always at war, always in debt. Tomb robbers were a real concern. If you were buried with your valuables, as many nobles were grave robbers, might dig you up before your body was cold. Family members squabbled over inheritance, rewriting wills or bribing clergy to reinterpret your final wishes. And if you had enemies at court, they might go a step further and erase you from the records entirely. Your name scrubbed clean from the annals of history by someone wealthier or more powerful than you, and always looking for ways to refill their coffers. You could be hit with extra levies, summoned to pay for some royal campaign, or forced to donate land to a cause you didn't believe in. And if you refused, suddenly you're labeled a traitor or a rebel. The king's men would arrive at your estate with a smile and a scroll, and just like that, your possessions were no longer yours. You were either a miser or a fool, and people always found ways to whisper about how you got your fortune in the first place. Were your ancestors slavers? Did you swindle peasants out of their land? The past had a way of haunting the rich, especially if you couldn't defend yourself from the gossip. Marriages, perhaps the cruelest part of being rich in medieval times, was the constant, gnawing anxiety. You were never truly at peace, and heaven forbid you fall on hard times. Wealth was fleeting. A few poor harvests, a failed political gamble, or a defeat in battle could leave you bankrupt. So yes, being rich meant you could eat roast swan instead of boiled turnips, and you could wrap yourself in velvet rather than wool. You were admired and envied, but you were also watched, hunted, and used. Your wealth made you powerful, but it also made you vulnerable. And in a world where power shifted like sand and loyalty could be bought for a coin, that vulnerability could prove fatal. In the end, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't the pressure, the politics, or the paranoia. It was the fact that you could never stop looking over your shoulder. Because someone, somewhere, always wanted what you had. Poison was always on the menu. Being rich in medieval times was not the fairy tale most people imagine. Sure, you had land, servants, feasts that stretched late into the candlelit night, and clothes so fine they sparkled in the sun. But beneath that luxurious veneer was a world of constant fear, where every sip of wine or bite of meat might be your last. Because when you were wealthy, poison was always on the menu. There was something uniquely terrifying about living in a world where your dinner could kill you. Poison wasn't some distant, rare occurrence. It was a constant threat lurking on your plate, seeping into your goblet, hidden in your pastries. It didn't matter how powerful you were. In fact, the more power you had, the more enemies you collected, and the more likely it was that someone somewhere was plotting your demise with a handful of toxic herbs. Wealth, for all its comforts, meant you were surrounded by people cooks, servants, advisors, entertainers, all of whom had access to your table. Your food passed through many hands before it reached you. A sprinkle of powdered arsenic, a drop of belladonna, a crushed monkshood flower. These were the tools of murder that left no trace of blood. You could be laughing with your guests one minute and clawing at your throat the next. The kitchen itself was a battlefield. While the peasants ate coarse bread and onion broth, the noble classes dined on elaborate meals: pheasant, stewed hare, spiced fish, and intricately baked pastries. It all looked grand, but it masked a terrifying truth. The richer your food, the easier it was to hide a lethal dose of poison. Strong spices could conceal bitter tastes. Thick sauces covered strange smells. Exotic ingredients from faraway lands were already unfamiliar to the palate. If your cook wanted you dead, or if someone bribed or threatened them, it wouldn't be hard to make it happen. And cooks were vulnerable. They were often poorly paid, and they had families to protect. Threats, coercion, or even a simple bag of silver could convince a desperate servant to betray their master. It didn't even have to be personal. Political enemies, rival nobles, or even jealous relatives could orchestrate an attack. All it took was one dish served at the right moment, and the deed was done. Of course, the rich knew this. They were paranoid. Meals were often preceded by rituals of safety. Food tasters were common, usually low-ranking servants, who would try a portion of every dish before their lord dared to lift a spoon. But tasters were no guarantee of survival. Some poisons took hours to act. Others worked slowly, building up in the body over time. A taster might live through the meal, and you might die in agony by morning. Imagine the constant fear. Sitting at your banquet table, surrounded by guests, pretending to enjoy a roasted boar or a honey-glazed quail, while your mind raced with suspicion. Who stood to gain from your death? Who looked a little too eager to refill your wine? Was that cough from the wine, or something far worse? Every bite was a gamble. Every swallow a possible sentence. Even your family couldn't be trusted. In fact, they were sometimes the most likely suspects. Inheritance was everything in the medieval world. If you were the head of a noble house, your death could elevate a cousin, a sibling, or even your own children. History is full of whisperings of noble sons who grew tired of waiting, of wives who grew tired of their husbands, of brothers who slipped a little something into the stew and inherited a castle by morning. Power corrupted, and greed ran deep. Love did not always run deeper. Women of wealth were especially vulnerable. A rich heiress was a political pawn and a tempting target. If she refused a suitor, if she stood in the way of a brother's ambition, if she married into the wrong house, she could find herself with a goblet of poisoned wine at her bedside. Some women died quietly, their passing mourned with elaborate funerals. Others lingered in agony, their symptoms mistaken for illness or hysteria. Very few people asked questions. After all, who wanted to accuse a noble family of murder? Who dared? Royal courts were the most dangerous places of all. At court, the stakes were enormous, and the knives were metaphorical until they weren't. Poison became a political tool, the weapon of choice for those who couldn't afford open war. It was discreet, effective, and deniable. If a rival died of a mysterious illness, you could feign sympathy and quietly celebrate their absence. Everyone at court knew this, of course. They eyed their goblets suspiciously and trusted no one, not even their closest allies. Alchemists and apothecaries knew the value of poisons. Some were hired to create them in secret, crafting deadly tinctures disguised as medicines. Others were paid handsomely for antidotes, though the price was high, and sometimes the cure arrived too late. Rich nobles often kept private stashes of both poison and antidote, hedging their bets in a world where trust was a currency no one could afford. You might think the church would have helped offering moral guidance, condemning the use of poison. But even there, things weren't simple. Poison was seen as a crime of secrecy, and secrecy was the devil's playground. Yet the church itself was not immune to the politics of death. Cardinals, bishops, even popes had enemies. Some were poisoned by rivals within the clergy. Others were taken down by secular lords who wanted influence over church lands. Wealth, again, was the common thread in Poison the Quiet Killer that respected no robes or titles. For the rich, even their food became a prison. They often dined in small private chambers instead of grand halls. They limited their guest lists, avoided shared meals, and scrutinized their staff with increasing suspicion. They developed strange habits, eating only food prepared by trusted hands, drinking only from cups that hadn't left their sight, or fasting for long periods to avoid risk altogether. They weren't ascetics. They were afraid. It's easy to look back and romanticize medieval wealth, the feasts, the castles, the velvet and gold. But beneath that glamour was a deadly game. Riches brought comfort, yes, but they also brought enemies. Enemies who didn't need swords or armies to kill you. Just a single drop of poison, a touch of powdered death, a bowl of soup with a little something extra. What made it worse was the silence. Unlike the clanging of armor or the roar of battle, poison was a killer that left no echo. It struck in the quiet of night, during the hum of conversation, beneath the music of the minstrels. And afterward, life continued as if nothing had happened. There were no arrests, no trials, just whispers. The rich learned to live with those whispers, knowing they might someday be the subject of them. That was the true horror. Not the death itself, but the waiting. The knowledge that someone might already be plotting, that your next meal might be your last. That behind the smiling face of a cousin, the respectful bow of a servant, or the warm words of a guest, death could be hiding, slowly stirred into your wine, carefully folded into your pie. You were rich, yes, but in a world where poison was always on the menu, that just meant you had more to lose, and more people willing to take it from you, one careful, quiet, untraceable bite at a time. Luxury meant rotting teeth and gout. In the glittering candlelight of a medieval feast hall, surrounded by tapestries, servants, and silver goblets, the life of a nobleman might have seemed like paradise to the starving peasant outside the stone walls. But behind the opulence and velvet-lined chambers, the reality of being rich in the medieval world came with a different kind of suffering, one brought on not by deprivation, but by excess. For the elite of the Middle Ages, luxury often meant rotting teeth, swollen joints, and excruciating pain. And if you had gout, you were part of an exclusive, agonized club. The rich in medieval Europe defined themselves not just by what they wore or where they lived, but by what they ate. Food was a symbol of power, indulgence, and status. To show off their wealth, nobles feasted on exotic imports and excessive portions of meat, sugar, and wine. Spices from India, sugar from Cyprus, and wines from France or Italy were proudly paraded at banquets. While the poor were grinding their molars on dark, coarse bread and vegetable stew, the wealthy were picking at trays of roast swan, eel pie, and honey-glazed confections, all washed down with gallons of sweet wine. But that rich diet came at a price. Sugar, a prized rarity, was used generously by those who could afford it. It wasn't just a sweetener. It was medicine, a spice, a luxury, and a status symbol all in one. The wealthy ate it in cakes, in sauces, even on meat. And the result? Their teeth began to rot right out of their mouths. Before the advent of modern dentistry, tooth decay was not just painful, it was catastrophic. Rich nobles, despite their wealth, often had blackened stumps for teeth, infected gums, and constant agony. Imagine sitting through a grand feast surrounded by roasted meats and sugary treats, unable to enjoy a bite without a jolt of pain shooting through your skull. And then there was gout, the disease of kings. Known today as a form of arthritis caused by high levels of uric acid in the blood, gout in the medieval period was a badge of upper-class indulgence. Its symptoms were unmistakable: burning, stabbing pain in the joints, especially the big toe. So severe was the swelling and discomfort that sufferers often couldn't wear shoes or even have a bedsheet brush against their foot without howling in pain. In a way, gout was a twisted compliment. It meant you were eating too well. The condition was caused by overconsumption of purine-rich foods, such as red meat, seafood, organ meats, and alcohol, all staples of the upper-class diet. A peasant had almost no chance of developing gout. They couldn't afford the diet that caused it. But the rich were practically marinating in meat and wine. For medieval physicians, gout was a mystery wrapped in medieval humoral theory. They believed the condition came from an imbalance in the bodily humors, especially an excess of phlegm or black bile. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the barbaric. Some recommended placing a roasted owl on the affected area. Others turned to bloodletting, believing that draining bad blood could cure the swelling. None of it worked. Even kings were not spared. King Henry VIII of England, famous for his rotund figure and lavish lifestyle, suffered terribly from gout in his later years. Paintings of the once dashing monarch began to show him bloated, hunched, and grimacing with pain. He became so crippled that he had to be carried around his palace in a specially designed chair. Henry's enormous appetite and thirst for alcohol didn't just cost him his waistline, it cost him his mobility and his peace. But the suffering wasn't confined to the later years of life. Even young nobles fell victim to the rot and ruin of luxury. Girls raised on sugared almonds and honeyed fruits began losing teeth in their teens. Wealthy boys trained for knighthood sometimes found themselves sidelined, not by wounds of war, but by the swollen joints of early-onset gout. The very lifestyle that was supposed to elevate them above the peasants often robbed them of the ability to walk, eat, or even smile. And then there was the smell. Poor dental hygiene, festering gums, and rotting molars turned the mouths of nobles into horror shows. They might wear robes embroidered with gold thread and dine off plates of silver, but their breath could knock over a horse. Perfumes, cloves, and mint leaves were often chewed or held under the nose to mask the stench of one's own decaying teeth or a lord's rancid breath. Ironically, while the rich suffered in luxury, the poor eating a bland but natural diet of whole grains, root vegetables, and occasional legumes often had better teeth. Archaeological remains reveal that peasant skulls from the Middle Ages tend to have more intact teeth than those of the elite. They couldn't afford sugar, and they rarely had enough meat to cause uric acid to spike. They may have suffered malnutrition and hunger, but their joints were less likely to seize up, and their teeth didn't rot like blackened stumps by the age of 30. To make matters worse, medieval fashion didn't do the afflicted any favors. Pointed shoes, popular among the wealthy, were pure torture for a person with gout. Layers of heavy robes and armor became impossible to wear when one's joints were too inflamed to move. In a social world that prized hunting, riding, and dancing, gout turned nobles into spectators of their own lives, watching from cushioned chairs as others enjoyed the activities they once dominated. And yet, in a strange twist of culture, having gout almost became fashionable. It was proof that you were noble, that you ate like a king. Some nobles bragged about it. Physicians wrote that gout was a gentleman's sea disease, and speculated that it kept worse illnesses at bay. Better to have gout, they argued, than leprosy or plague. Some even believed it sharpened the mind. Of course, these were mostly opinions of the very people suffering from it, justifying their misery with a strange sense of superiority. But there was nothing superior about crying out in pain during the night because your toe was on fire. There was nothing noble about sipping wine through a gap where your front teeth used to be. There was no dignity in having your servants carry you to the feast table because you couldn't hobble 10 steps without gasping. The worst part? There was no real cure. All the wealth in the world couldn't buy relief. The richest nobles in Europe had access to the finest doctors, the rarest herbs, and the most expensive remedies, but none of it made much difference. They were prisoners of their own indulgence, paying the price for every gluttonous bite and every decadent sip. Luxury in the medieval world wasn't about comfort. It was a gamble. It promised pleasure, but often delivered pain. It let you rise above the commoners, only to bring you low with afflictions born of excess. The poor envied the rich, but they didn't see the swollen toes, the sleepless nights, or the aching gums hidden behind the castle walls. So the next time you picture medieval wealth golden goblets, roaring fires, tables groaning with food, remember what came with it. You weren't just getting a seat at the Lord's table. You were signing up for a lifetime of pain with every sugary bite and every overflowing goblet. Your title might have said noble, but your breath stank, your joints screamed, and your smile was little more than a rotted grimace. In the end, for the rich of the Middle Ages, luxury didn't just rot your teeth, it rotted you from the inside out. You couldn't trust anyone. In a world where your wealth was supposed to be your shield, being rich in medieval times often made you more vulnerable than safe. Behind every smile was a sharpened dagger, and every toast could be your last. If you were wealthy, you didn't sleep peacefully at night. You slept with one eye open, always wondering if your servant had been bribed. If your cousin thought himself the rightful heir, or if the wine in your goblet had a bitter aftertaste. Trust, in this gilded cage of feasts and finery, was a luxury you simply couldn't afford. The medieval nobleman or lady lived behind thick stone walls, surrounded by servants, guards, scribes, stewards, and courtiers. And yet, those very walls couldn't keep out the one thing that truly threatened the rich more than disease or war: betrayal. Whether from family, friends, clergy, or retainers, treachery was a constant whisper in the halls. Alliances shifted like the wind, and no one, not even your own children, could be completely trusted. Your wealth wasn't just a source of comfort. It was a target. Castles weren't only built to keep enemies out, they were designed to control the people within. A rich man's hall might be full of laughter, song, and clinking cups, but that merriment was laced with suspicion. The richer you were, the more people had something to gain from your downfall. Land, titles, livestock, or even just the favor of a rival king. There was always someone who saw your death as a stepping stone to their own success. Imagine you're a powerful baron, and your lands stretch across valleys, your banners fluttering proudly from turret tops. You feast with lords and entertain bishops, but your wife's family has always looked at you sideways. Her brother feels humiliated you outrank him. One night, a bottle of sweetened wine arrives courtesy of your brother-in-law. It's poisoned. The symptoms mimic dysentery. No one would suspect a thing. Meanwhile, your grieving wife inherits everything and promptly remarries the very man who sent the gift. Even within your household, betrayal simmered. Stewards and chamberlains handled your accounts, and a clever one could siphon your silver for years without being caught. Spies posing as cooks or stable boys might send detailed reports to your enemies. The trusted priest who heard your confessions could be reporting them to the bishop or even blackmailing you. Confessionals weren't sealed with the divine when politics were involved. If your sins were juicy enough, they became weapons. Friendship was fraught with danger. Among nobles, all eyes were temporary and based entirely on mutual benefit. One day, you and the neighboring duke were toasting at each other's tables, hunting together in the woods, sealing your son's friendship with a shared falcon. The next, you hear he's taken your tenant farmers and is pressing the king to revoke your claim to a valuable tract of land. Nobles plotted and schemed with an enthusiasm that would make modern politicians blush. Even marriage, that supposed cornerstone of dynastic alliances, was a minefield. You didn't marry for love. You married for land, for power, for a claim to something bigger. And just because you were rich didn't mean you were immune to being used. A beautiful young noblewoman might be placed in your home not to warm your bed, but to steal your secrets or manipulate your children. A clever wife could poison you slowly over years, just enough to make you seem sickly until your will named her sole heir. Servants, of course, were no better. You fed them, clothed them, gave them protection in a harsh world, and in return, they could slit your throat in the night for a handful of coin. The kitchen boy knew the layout of your chambers. The laundress had access to your linens. The valet brought your wine, adjusted your pillows, laced your boots. Any of them could be bought, bribed, or blackmailed. Revolts and uprisings weren't just problems for kings. Rich lords and ladies often found themselves the targets of peasants' fury. Even a minor insult, a new tax, an unjust trial, or a harsh punishment could stir rebellion. When your wealth and comfort stood in sharp contrast to your starving tenants, trust was a fantasy. You'd ride through your lands surrounded by guards, knowing the people bowed because they had to, not because they wanted to. You might smile at the old woman spinning flax at her door, not knowing she was the mother of a man you had hanged last winter. You might stop at a village to collect taxes and find the well has been poisoned. The bread offered to your retinue is spoiled. Your horse throws a shoe at just the wrong moment, and suddenly you're surrounded. Even the church, supposedly your spiritual refuge, was no haven. Wealthy nobles were often deeply entangled in church politics. Bishops wanted patronage, abbots wanted land. Monks might praise you in one breath and curse your name in the next if your donations dried up. Religious leaders could manipulate public opinion, convincing the faithful that your soul was damned unless you donated yet another tract of farmland to their abbey. Riches bought favor, but only temporarily. One false move, one blasphemy, and your allies in the clergy could become your accusers. A pious crowd could be whipped into a frenzy, convinced you were a heretic or worse. And heaven help you if you were named in a heresy trial. The Inquisition did not discriminate by social class. A rich noble suspected of harboring unorthodox beliefs, or even just possessing books not approved by the church, could find himself denounced. The trial would be public, the confessions likely tortured. And all the while, your rivals circled like vultures, eyeing the lands and titles that would soon be up for grabs. Even children weren't safe from this atmosphere of paranoia. If you had heirs, you had enemies. Your eldest son might be brave and loyal, or he might be impatient, tired of waiting for you to die. There were stories whispered across Europe of sons who accelerated their inheritance by slipping something into their father's wine. And if you had daughters, well, they were pawns in other men's ambitions. Marrying them off was a matter of strategic importance, and your decisions could make lifelong enemies. Alliances were fragile, rivalries eternal. And when a nobleman fell, he fell hard. Confiscation, exile, execution, these were not rare outcomes. One whispered rumor at court could destroy you. A scandal involving a mistress, a foolish drunken boast, or a misplaced insult could turn the king against you. And once that happened, the floodgates opened. Your enemies, who had smiled so warmly over wine, would be the first to testify against you. You might end your days in a dungeon, forgotten and starving, or forced into a monastery with vows of silence. Your once loyal friends would speak of you in the past tense, even while your body still clung to life. Your lands would be carved up, your castle flying another man's banner, your family disgraced. And even if somehow you managed to die of old age in your own bed, surrounded by family, could you really be sure that wasn't by design? Perhaps your steward had seen your final decline as a relief. Perhaps your wife had already arranged her next marriage. Perhaps your son wasn't grieving, but planning. Even in death, the rich could not rest in peace. Tombs were looted, wills forged, legacies rewritten. So yes, wealth in the medieval world came with feasts, horses, fine garments, and power. But beneath the glittering surface was a pit of vipers. You could have a crown, a title, and an estate stretching to the horizon, but you could never have peace of mind. To be rich was to live a life of relentless suspicion, political gamesmanship, and the constant knowing fear that your closest ally might be your killer. In the end, it wasn't the battlefield that claimed the most lords. It was betrayal. Quiet, subtle, and personal. The knife in the back, the poisoned cup, the whispered accusation. In a world where everyone wanted what you had, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't the weight of your gold. It was the crushing truth that you couldn't trust anyone. Heirs were a blood sport. In the medieval world, the greatest danger to a wealthy nobleman wasn't always an invading army or a scheming rival. Sometimes the most lethal threat came from within his own household. Being rich in medieval times meant you had land, titles, vassals, gold, and influence. But above all, it meant you had something to pass down. And that's where things got ugly. Because in an era without DNA tests, ironclad wills, or security cameras, succession wasn't a simple affair. It was a blood sport. The minute a lord's health began to fail, the vultures started circling. Sons eyed their aging father with impatience. Brothers whispered conspiracies. And distant cousins suddenly came out of the woodwork with claims to the inheritance. If a nobleman had the misfortune of dying without clearly naming an heir, or even worse, naming one that others disagreed with, it could ignite a civil war within his own family. Riches didn't bring peace. They brought blood feuds. It wasn't just about castles and coin. Titles were power. A barony, a dukedom, or a countship wasn't just ceremonial. It meant you had knights under your command, villages paying you taxes, and the king's ear. Losing your claim to such wealth didn't mean poverty. It could mean death or disgrace. And when the stakes were that high, people played dirty. Even within the same family, alliances were fragile. Imagine a nobleman with 3 sons. The eldest, by tradition, would inherit everything under primogeniture. But what if the second son was more ambitious? What if the third had the backing of a powerful uncle? Suddenly, accidents began to happen. Hunting trips ended in tragedy. Cups of wine turned sour. And servants, always watching, might quietly switch their allegiance, depending on which heir seemed likeliest to win. Even queens weren't safe. A noble woman might see her sons turned against one another, each trying to seize power before the others could. She might find herself manipulated or pushed aside as various factions struggled for dominance. And if she dared to take a side, especially a losing one, she could find herself locked away in a tower or sent to a convent. Disputes over inheritance could tear entire kingdoms apart. The War of the Roses in England began as a dynastic struggle between 2 branches of the same royal family. But beneath the grand politics were countless smaller tragedies. Brothers killing brothers, nephews betraying uncles, families wiped out by ambition gone mad. The richer the bloodline, the more it seemed to attract knives. And inheritance didn't just mean gold and land. It meant marriage alliances. A wealthy noblewoman might be promised to a man she despised all to secure a claim or strengthen a faction. Her body became another pawn in the great game. If she objected, she was told her duty came before her desires. If she resisted too much, she might find herself forcibly cloistered or mysteriously ill. Then there was the matter of illegitimate children. Bastards, as they were bluntly called, walked a precarious line. Some were acknowledged and even favored, especially if the legitimate heir was weak or absent. Others were used as pawns by ambitious mothers or noblemen seeking to undermine a rival. A whispered rumor about a child's parentage could spark chaos. Was he truly the duke's son? Or had the lady consorted with a knight during her husband's long crusade? These whispers often became swords. A claim made at the right time, say, during a noble's funeral or in the chaos following a battle, could shift the balance of power. Supporters flocked to whichever heir seemed most likely to reward them. And once a claimant had men, arms, and the blessing of the church, they could challenge the ruling heir outright. Inheritance wasn't just a legal issue. It was a battlefield. Castles were seized by force. Loyal retainers switched sides. Towns were looted by mercenaries hired to press a claim. And when the smoke cleared, it was the peasants who suffered. Crops were burned, livestock stolen, and entire villages depopulated, all because some nobleman's third son thought he deserved a bigger slice of the pie. Even kings weren't immune. Henry II of England saw his sons rebel against him, egged on by their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. When a king's own sons took up arms against him, it was clear that wealth and power could corrupt blood itself. And it didn't end with rebellion. Kings were assassinated, dethroned, or exiled by the very heirs they had once bounced on their knee. Nothing was sacred. And heaven help you if you were a child heir. If a nobleman died young and left behind a boy of 7, the sharks began to circle. Regents were appointed to guide the young heir, but too often they used their power for their own ends. Sometimes the child vanished mysteriously. Other times he grew up to reclaim his throne after years of war and suffering. But more often, he simply became another casualty of the brutal chess game of inheritance. The church, too, was a player in this blood sport. Bishops might bless a favorite heir in return for land or influence. Papal dispensations could legitimize a bastard or annul a marriage that had produced an inconvenient heir. Monks scribbled genealogies that favored whichever side paid better. And confessions taken on deathbeds were carefully manipulated to serve political ends. All of this meant that being rich in medieval times came with a curse. Every dinner might include a cousin with a dagger in his sleeve. Every servant might be a spy for a rival sibling. Every alliance had an expiration date. There was no rest, not even in death. The moment a nobleman died, the real war began not against enemies, but against his own blood. This paranoia seeped into every aspect of aristocratic life. Heirs were often raised apart to avoid poisoning or manipulation. Marriages were strategic chess moves. Trust was in short supply. Nobles frequently turned to astrologers and mystics to predict the future and warn of betrayal. Fortunes were spent on bodyguards and secret rooms. And yet, none of it guaranteed safety. Because in the end, wealth was a magnet for betrayal. The more you had, the more others wanted it. And when your own family was willing to spill blood for your lands, titles, or crown, the line between kin and killer vanished. It wasn't just survival of the fittest, it was survival of the most ruthless. And so the rich of the medieval world lived in castles with thick walls but no peace. Their tapestries showed noble lineages, but behind each noble portrait was a ghost and uncle poisoned, a sister forced into a nunnery, a brother who vanished on a hunting trip. The family tree was nourished not by roots, but by spilled blood. Heirs weren't just successors. They were threats. They were weapons. They were pawns and players in a deadly game with no rules and no mercy. And for the rich in medieval times, nothing was more dangerous than the people who shared their blood. Paranoia was your daily companion. In the gilded halls of medieval castles, behind heavy velvet curtains and beside roaring hearths, paranoia thrived. To the outside world, the life of a rich noble or royal seemed enviable feasting in banquet halls, clad in silk and jewels, with armies at command and peasants at service. But beneath the polished surface, wealth was a curse in disguise. Every goblet of wine, every letter from a distant cousin, every seemingly harmless servant entering the room could be a threat. Because when you were rich in the medieval world, you weren't just admired. You were envied, resented, and worst of all, targeted. Paranoia wasn't a condition. It was a necessity for survival. From the moment you were born into privilege, a quiet war began. If you were the firstborn son of a powerful lord, you were the heir to land, titles, and influence. That made you valuable and expendable. If your elder brother died in a hunting accident, no one would question it. But if he fell ill after a shared meal, and you miraculously stayed healthy, whispers would circulate. Did you bribe the cook? Did you poison the wine? You might not have done anything, but suspicion would cling to your name like smoke. And in return, you'd start to wonder if your own food was safe. Poison was the silent killer of courts. It was elegant, discreet, and left fewer marks than a blade. Nobles began employing official tasters to try their meals before they did not out of culinary curiosity, but out of sheer fear. These poor souls would eat small portions of food while the Lord watched, eyes fixed for the slightest sign of a stomach cramp or a drop of sweat. Only after a tense few minutes, if the taster remained upright, would the Lord allow himself a bite. And even then, his hand might shake as he raised the spoon. It was an indulgence that made these people anxious. It was the knowledge that their status was a target painted on their back, and anyone, from family to servant, might take the shot. Inside the manor, betrayal often came from those closest to you. The servants who dressed you knew your vulnerabilities. They knew where you slept, how you liked your wine, which windows were left open at night. And while most were loyal, or at least fearful of retribution, all it took was one desperate soul, one bribe from a rival family, or one promise of freedom to turn a loyal retainer into an assassin. Rich lords often rotated their staff for this reason, never letting one person grow too familiar. But that only made things worse. The constant change meant you were surrounded by strangers, some with motives you couldn't even begin to guess. You couldn't relax, not even in your own chambers. At court, the paranoia worsened. The richer you were, the more dangerous the political game became. Nobles smiled and bowed to each other, but behind every gesture was a calculation. A misplaced word at a feast could be twisted into treason. A refusal to marry a politically convenient partner could provoke a vendetta. The monarch, no matter how benevolent he appeared, was always watching. Rich courtiers who grew too powerful or too popular often met mysterious ends. Some were arrested on fabricated charges. Others vanished during hunting trips or died suddenly of illness. And the richer you were, the more power you had to lose, and the more people who wanted to take it from you. Even your own family was not above suspicion. Inheritance disputes tore noble houses apart. Younger sons who stood to inherit nothing sometimes took drastic steps to change their fortunes. Cousins schemed against one another, attempting to prove illegitimacy or insanity to push others out of succession. Daughters, whose marriages were political tools, were often treated with distrust by their own brothers. If she married into a rival house, could she be trusted not to betray family secrets? Was her sudden return to the castle a sign of reconciliation or reconnaissance? The church offered little solace. Clergy were often entwined in noble affairs, and wealth attracted attention from both holy men and those pretending to be holy. Rich landowners found themselves the subject of sermons, accused of sin or heresy for not donating enough to the church, or for donating too much to the wrong bishop. Confessionals became dangerous. What if your priest spoke too freely? What if your sins were used as blackmail? Even the pious could not escape the creeping fear that faith might be manipulated against them. In moments of peace, the silence itself became unnerving. A calm season without plots or accidents only meant that something was brewing. Was your rival laying low? Was your sister biding her time? Had your steward finally been bought off? And so, you started to listen at doors. You bribed servants to spy on each other. You read letters twice, then burned them. You staged accidents to test loyalty. You accused innocents just to see who defended them. Slowly, inevitably, You became the very thing you feared, paranoid, vindictive, and hollowed out by suspicion. Sleep offered no relief. You might lie on featherbeds beneath canopies of gold-threaded silk, but your dreams were haunted by betrayal. Some nobles slept in different rooms every night, a habit born of fear. Others had armed guards posted outside their doors. Some even kept weapons under their pillows. Imagine being so wealthy that your biggest fear ascended to poverty, but waking up with a knife at your throat. As you aged, your paranoia only deepened. You saw your allies die off, one by one. You watched new generations of nobles rise with their own ambitions and alliances. Your body weakened, but your enemies grew stronger. And worst of all, you began to see threats in the eyes of your own children. Would your son be content to wait for your death? Would your daughter, married to a rival lord, remember your kindness or seek your downfall? The wealth you had built and protected your whole life now became a noose around your neck. Every coin you owned, every estate in your name, became something someone else wanted. You had made it to the top and found yourself utterly alone. Wealth in the medieval world did not grant peace of mind. It bought influence, but not safety. It brought luxury, but not love. It provided servants and soldiers, but no guarantee of loyalty. Paranoia was not a flaw of the rich. It was the logical response to a world where power meant danger, and survival required constant vigilance. In the end, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't just the possibility of being poisoned, betrayed, or overthrown. It was living every single day as if those things were already happening. To be wealthy was to live with your back against the wall, your goblet half drained, and your eyes constantly searching the shadows. Not because you were mad, but because you couldn't afford not to be. You were stuck in a suit of honor. At first glance, being rich in medieval times sounds like something out of a fairy tale. You imagine gleaming castles, roaring feasts, tapestries fluttering from stone walls, and silken robes worn by candlelight. You picture knights on horseback, banners flapping in the wind, and proud noblemen overseeing their lands. But behind the splendor lay a burden that few ever talk about. If you were rich in medieval Europe, you weren't just privileged. You were trapped. You were stuck in a suit of honor that weighed more than any armor you wore. Wealth came with expectations, and those expectations were suffocating. The moment you were born into a noble family, your life was decided for you. You were not free to wander the fields or choose your own destiny. You were a symbol of your family name, a living embodiment of pride and status. And that meant you were expected to live by the unbending code of honor. It wasn't just a set of ideals. It was a chain wrapped around your neck from the moment you drew your first breath. Honor governed everything. How you dressed, how you spoke, whom you married, what you ate, how you sat on a horse, how you drew a sword. There was no room for error. Your slightest misstep could cause whispers in the court, shame your entire bloodline, or give your enemies ammunition to use against you. You were taught not just how to behave, but how to appear. Being rich didn't mean you got to be yourself. It meant you had to perform every day, like your life depended on it. Because in many cases, it did. From an early age, you were trained not in freedom, but in duty. If you were a boy, that meant years of training with swords and lances, learning to ride a war horse before you could even write your name. You were taught the art of war before you understood the meaning of peace. Pain and exhaustion became your companions. Your instructors were ruthless. Crying was weakness. Hesitation was failure. You were rich, yes, but you were raised like a soldier. You were being groomed for a future you didn't choose and couldn't escape. And if you were a girl, your path was no less constricted. You were expected to be the perfect lady, graceful and obedient, a flower plucked and prepared for marriage. Your education was in courtly manners, music, embroidery, and silence. You were a vessel for alliances. Your marriage would not be yours to decide. It would be arranged to strengthen your family's power, often to a man much older, someone you barely knew or didn't like. You were expected to be loyal, fertile, and invisible. Love was a luxury you weren't allowed to hope for. The worst part was the pressure never ended. As a nobleman, you had to defend your reputation constantly. A single insult could start a feud. A minor dispute could lead to a duel. You were not allowed to back down. Honor demanded that you respond, whether you wanted to or not. Sometimes honor meant blood. You might have to fight a friend, kill a rival, or throw yourself into a war simply because retreat would make you look weak. And appearances were everything. You weren't just defending yourself. You were defending your family, your ancestors, and every person who shared your name. And honor didn't just apply in war. It followed you into the banquet hall. If you ate too little, you were ungrateful. Too much, and you were gluttonous. If you laughed at the wrong joke, you were undignified. If you said too little, you were cold. Every gesture mattered. Every word carried weight. A poorly timed comment at a feast could destroy your standing. A misread gesture could spark a political firestorm. The court was a stage, and you were never off script. Even in moments of personal grief, you were not allowed to drop the mask. If your child died, you were expected to mourn with decorum. If your brother was murdered, you were expected to seek vengeance with restraint. Emotional outbursts were for the lower classes. You were noble. You were to be a statue carved in stone, not a person of flesh and feeling. Your sorrow had to be elegant. Your rage had to be strategic. You couldn't break down. You couldn't show fear. You were stuck in a suit of honor that never came off. You could not fail. If you lost a battle, your enemies mocked you. If your estate suffered poor harvests, the peasants grumbled, and other nobles questioned your competence. You were not allowed to make mistakes. You could not say, "I don't know." You were expected to lead, to command, to inspire, whether you were ready or not. Sometimes that pressure drove men mad. It made them cruel. It forced them into wars they couldn't win, marriages they couldn't survive, decisions they could never undo. But the code of honor didn't care. It only demanded obedience. The suit of honor was heaviest when you tried to take it off. Suppose you were a nobleman who didn't like violence, who preferred books to battle. Suppose you were a noblewoman who wanted to govern her own land, speak her mind, or refuse a marriage. The answer was always the same. No, the world would not bend for you. You had to bend for it. If you resisted, you were labeled a disgrace, a heretic, a danger. People whispered behind your back. Some tried to remove you altogether. Riches didn't protect you. In fact, they made your disobedience more dangerous. A poor man's rebellion was pitied. A rich man's rebellion was punished. Even your clothing became a form of imprisonment. You were expected to wear your wealth like armor. Fine silk, elaborate brocade, gold-threaded tunics, and long velvet robes that marked your rank but restricted your movement. You were draped in symbols of power that didn't always feel like your own. And beneath it all, you might long for something simpler. A life free from ceremony and expectation. But that life was forbidden to you. You didn't belong to yourself. You belonged to your class, your bloodline, your name. And if you failed to live up to the role, there was no mercy. You could be exiled, stripped of your lands, imprisoned, or quietly assassinated. Riches did not buy forgiveness. They only raised the stakes. The more you had, the more you had to lose. And there were always people waiting to see you fall. In the end, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't the danger of war or the threat of betrayal. It wasn't the constant political scheming or even the fear of poison. It was the weight of honor, the invisible suit you wore every hour of your life, the role you had to play even when you were exhausted, grieving, afraid, or broken, because being rich didn't make you free. It made you a prisoner of your own status. And there was no key, no escape, only the endless burden of performance. You were expected to be a paragon, a hero, a symbol. But behind the grand banners and gleaming armor, you were just a person, trapped in a role you never asked for, stuck in a suit of honor that only ever grew heavier with time. Religious pressure was intense. It might seem strange to think that being rich in the medieval world came with its own set of chains. After all, weren't the nobility free to do as they pleased? Didn't they dine like kings, live in castles, and ride through villages with peasants bowing at their feet? But beneath the gold and velvet, there was a constant, suffocating force bearing down on the wealthy, a force stronger than any army, heavier than any crown. That force was religion, and it did not whisper. It shouted, it judged, it pressed down on every decision, every desire, and every ounce of joy a wealthy person tried to enjoy. In medieval Europe, religion was not just a matter of private belief. It was the law, the culture, the air people breathed. The church stood as the most powerful institution in the land, often more influential than the kings themselves. And while everyone, from the lowest peasant to the loftiest noble, was expected to obey the teachings of the church, it was the rich who found themselves under the microscope. Their wealth was seen not only as a blessing, but also as a danger. It was believed that the more you had, the more likely you were to fall into sin. The wealthy were expected to set an example of holy living, and that pressure was crushing. Every coin a noble spent was shadowed by guilt. Was it being used for the glory of God or for selfish pleasure? That beautiful tapestry you hung in your hall might be seen as vanity. The lavish feast you hosted could be viewed as gluttony. Even wearing bright, richly dyed clothing could be condemned as prideful. The church had plenty to say about how the rich should live, and very little of it involved enjoying themselves. It was not enough to go to church. The rich were expected to build churches, fund monasteries, pay for the creation of stained glass windows, frescoes, and relic displays. Every act of wealth had to be balanced with a visible act of piety. Many nobles spent fortunes building chapels or endowing religious orders, not always because they were devoted, but because they feared what would happen to their souls if they did not. The threat of hell was real and constant. Paintings and sermons were filled with fire and torment. Wealthy sinners were a favorite target of preachers, who warned that the road to hell was paved with gold. The rich were portrayed in sermons as camels trying to pass through the eye of a needle. Stories of Judgment Day featured nobles dragged to their doom by chains of gold, while the poor were lifted to heaven for their humility. Guilt was not just a feeling, it was practically mandatory. This spiritual pressure took strange and dramatic forms. Some nobles took to wearing rough hair shirts under their fine garments to constantly remind themselves of Christ's suffering. Others paid to have masses said in their name every day, in hopes of trimming time off their eventual stay in purgatory. Some even joined religious orders late in life, giving up their titles and comforts out of sheer desperation to save their souls. But even the most dramatic gestures did not guarantee peace. The church was watching. Priests and bishops, many of them wealthy themselves, were quick to judge their fellow nobles. Confession became a terrifying ritual where the wealthy were forced to admit sins, not only of action, but of thought. Did you covet more land? Indulge in too much wine? Harbor impure thoughts? You had better confess and be ready to pay for absolution, often literally. The idea of indulgences began to creep in. These were donations made to the church in exchange for the forgiveness of sins or a shorter sentence in purgatory. The wealthy could afford more indulgences than the poor, but the implication was clear. Your soul was never fully safe. You could spend your life donating, confessing, fasting, and kneeling, and still wonder if your wealth was dragging you straight to damnation. Every major decision carried a moral burden. Marriage was not about love. It was about alliances, and the approval of the church. Picking the wrong partner could lead to scandal, excommunication, or worse. Even inheritance laws were tangled in religious rules. If you wanted to pass your estate on to your children, you had to make sure they were legitimate in the eyes of the church. That meant a proper church wedding, no mistresses, and no questioning the rules. There was no escape. Even in death, the pressure followed. The rich were expected to make elaborate plans for their funerals and afterlives. That meant funding chantries, where priests would pray for their souls every day. It meant bequeathing land to abbeys, paying for tomb sculptures, and leaving behind vast sums for charity. Not out of generosity, necessarily, but because dying rich and unrepentant was one of the quickest ways to end up in the fiery pit. The fear of judgment did not just haunt individuals. Entire noble families shaped their lives around religious expectations. One son was expected to join the clergy. A daughter might be packed off to a convent at the age of 12. Family honor and salvation were intertwined. If a relative was excommunicated, it cast a shadow over the entire lineage. Being rich meant your spiritual failings were not just your own problem. They were your family's burden for generations. And while the wealthy were bending under this spiritual pressure, they were also constantly being watched by those beneath them. The peasants may have lived harder lives, but they took comfort in the idea that the sins of the rich would be punished. It was almost a pastime to speculate which noble would end up in hell. Satirical poems and plays mocked the piety of the upper class, exposing hypocrisy and corruption. Even the appearance of religious neglect could spark rumors and resentment. What made this even more maddening was that the church itself was not immune to corruption. Many high-ranking clergy were from noble families and lived in almost as much luxury as the aristocrats they chastised. Bishops dined in palaces. Abbots hunted with falcons. Some even fathered children despite their vows of celibacy. So while the church preached poverty and humility, its own leaders often looked suspiciously like the rich sinners they condemned. This hypocrisy deepened the anxiety of the devout noble. If even the holy men were failing, what chance did anyone else have? Some tried to escape this pressure by retreating into mysticism or extreme forms of worship. Flagellation became a common practice among those desperate for penance. Wealthy individuals would join groups that marched through the streets, whipping themselves to bleed out their sins. Others sought visions or miracles, hoping for a sign that they were on the right path. But most simply lived in fear that they were enjoying too much, eating too well, dressing too finely, or speaking too freely. The medieval rich were not free. They were imprisoned by gold, by guilt, and by the constant gaze of an all-powerful church. The more they had, the more they had to justify it. Every coin and crumb came with a moral question. Every act of pleasure carried a shadow of sin. And, unlike the poor, who could only lose their meager comforts, the rich believed they had far more, staked their immortal souls. So when you picture a medieval noble sipping wine in a grand hall, remember this. That goblet might have been filled with guilt. That fur-lined robe might have itched with the scratch of penance beneath. And the laughter might have been forced, the smile tight, the heart heavy with fear. For the rich of the Middle Ages, religion was not a comfort. It was a hammer. And no amount of wealth could dull its blows. You couldn't just relax. You might think that being rich in medieval times meant long, lazy afternoons by the fire, soft beds piled with fur blankets, and servants tending to your every whim. But the truth is far from that dreamy illusion. If you were wealthy in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just relax. Not ever. Every moment of your life was governed by duty, danger, appearances, and endless anxiety. Leisure was a myth for the upper classes. Your wealth made you powerful. Yes, but it also made your life a high-stakes performance with no room for error. From the moment you opened your eyes in the morning, the clock was ticking. Your days weren't your own. If you were a lord or lady, your life was ruled by a schedule more demanding than that of any peasant. Every hour had a purpose. There were meetings with stewards, disputes among your tenants, decisions about taxes, punishments, harvests, and marriages. Your castle might be a fortress, but it was also an administrative center, a courtroom, a barracks, and a diplomatic hub. Everyone expected you to be in charge at all times. You couldn't afford to look weak. If you slipped up, made the wrong call, or angered the wrong person, you didn't just lose reputation. You might lose everything. Even something as simple as a meal was not a time to unwind. Meals were ceremonies. Nobles didn't just eat food, they performed it. You dined with dozens of eyes watching. Every bite you took, every sip of wine, every polite nod had to follow custom. The wrong gesture could be taken as an insult. The wrong seating arrangement could spark a feud. And of course, you were always aware that your food might be poisoned. You had tasters for a reason. Your clothing was a constant burden. To show your status, you had to wear the most expensive fabrics. Imported silks, heavy brocades, finely dyed wools. But these clothes weren't comfortable. They were stiff, layered, and constricting. You had to maintain posture at all times. Slouching was for the lowborn. Your every movement was a performance of grace and nobility. Relaxing in public made you seemed careless, even vulgar. Nobility came with a full-time dress code and etiquette checklist, and while peasants feared hunger and cold, the rich feared scandal. Every conversation could be twisted. Every rumor could be dangerous. Privacy didn't exist. Your servants saw and heard everything. A glance held too long with a lady. A drunken comment at a feast. A late-night meeting. All of it could be turned against you. Gossip moved fast in noble circles, and it had teeth. One rumor could reach the ears of a rival or the court, and from there, spiral into accusations, trials, and disgrace. And disgrace was something you never recovered from. It clung to your name, and your bloodline. Marriage was another battlefield. Rich nobles didn't marry for love. They married for land, power, alliances. And once married, your life was entangled with another family's ambitions. If your spouse was faithful, you were lucky. If not, you had to smile through it, hide the shame, and pray no one used it against you. Divorce was almost impossible. An affair could destroy your name. And if you had children, your responsibilities only grew. You didn't raise them to be happy. You raised them to marry well, fight well, and secure your legacy. Even their childhoods were rehearsals for power. Then there was war. As a noble, you didn't just command troops from a distance. You were expected to fight. That meant armor, weapons, training, and strategy. You couldn't just take a break from war when things got complicated. If your liege called, you had to answer. You marched, fought, and risked your life. You were not safe in your castle. Castles could be sieged, fires could be set. Enemies could tunnel beneath your walls. And if captured, your wealth didn't protect you. It marked you as valuable. That meant a hefty ransom, long imprisonment, or even a gruesome public death. Even religion offered little peace. The church had immense power and expected constant displays of piety. You had to fund churches, host clergy, donate land, and attend endless services. Missing Mass could raise eyebrows. Being seen as ungodly or heretical could ruin you. And if you actually had doubts or questions about the faith, you kept them buried deep. The church had ways of dealing with those who spoke too freely. Travel was dangerous and exhausting. You couldn't simply ride out for fun. Roads were plagued with bandits and weather. To visit another lord's estate meant packing an entire retinue. guards, servants, gifts, and documentation. A casual visit might take weeks of planning, and when you arrived, the real work began: negotiations, alliances, hunting parties, gift exchanges, and long nights of drinking where you had to stay alert the entire time. One slip of the tongue, and your hosts could become enemies, and heaven help you if you were summoned to court. Royal courts were the most dangerous places of all. Every noble there had ambitions. Every eye was judging. You had to bring gifts, wear your finest clothes, flatter the right people, avoid offending others, and make yourself useful without appearing too eager. If the king or queen liked you, you gained favor. If they disliked you, even slightly, you could lose land, titles, or your life. It was a game you had to play constantly, and one wrong move could destroy everything. Sleep itself was never secure. Nobles were light sleepers. You didn't rest peacefully knowing assassins could slip into your chambers. Guards stood outside your door, but even they might be bribed. You often woke to urgent messages, arriving guests, sick children, or reports of unrest in your lands. You might lie on a feather-stuffed mattress under embroidered blankets, but you never really relaxed. Your mind was always churning with plans, fears, and threats. Even entertainment had its pressures. Hosting a feast wasn't for fun. It was a political display. You had to provide the best food, the finest musicians, the most elaborate performances. Your hospitality was a measure of your power, and you couldn't enjoy it. You had to circulate, charm guests, monitor the mood, keep your allies close, and watch your enemies. The feast wasn't for you. It was for your reputation. Your wealth made you the target of constant lawsuits, petitions, and requests. Everyone wanted something from you. A neighbor claimed your border markers were wrong. A cousin demanded a share of an inheritance. A monastery insisted you had promised them tithes years ago. You spent your life untangling these disputes, defending your rights, and trying to keep everyone at bay. Even aging was stressful. As you grew older, you had to prepare your legacy. Was your heir ready? Would your vassals remain loyal? Would your widow remarry wisely? You worried not just about your soul, but your reputation. Would you be remembered as wise or weak? Every action you took in your final years was meant to solidify your legacy and secure your bloodline. Death wasn't a release. It was a final deadline dot in the end. Being rich in the Middle Ages wasn't a relaxing fantasy. Some imagine it was a non-stop game of appearances, threats, obligations, and performance. There was no such thing as a peaceful day. Not really. Every glance, every handshake, every meal, every letter carried weight. You were always managing, always calculating, always bracing for what might come next dot. So while peasants might have broken backs and calloused hands, they also had moments of laughter, moments of rest under the sun, evenings around the fire with nothing to lose. But you, the noble, the lord, the lady, you had everything to lose and no time to breathe. Because in a world where power meant survival and trust meant risk, the worst thing about being rich in medieval times was that you simply couldn't just relax. Not for a single moment. One misstep could ruin you. In the medieval world, riches were a double-edged sword. While peasants envied the opulence of nobles and merchants, dreamed of climbing the social ladder, those who had already reached the top knew a terrifying truth. One wrong move could ruin everything. Wealth in the Middle Ages was not a fortress, it was a tightrope. And even the richest lords walked it with trembling feet. To be rich in medieval times meant you lived under constant scrutiny. Every word you spoke, every gesture you made, every decision you took, someone was always watching. And they weren't just watching out of curiosity. They were waiting for you to slip, to falter, to make one tiny mistake they could twist into a scandal or a reason for ruin. Your enemies never truly rested, and your friends were only loyal until it no longer suited them. Power came with privilege, yes, but it also came with endless obligations. If you were a nobleman, you were expected to be generous to your vassals, brave in battle, loyal to your king, respectful to the church, fair to your tenants, and dignified at court. Slip on any one of those expectations, and you could fall faster. And you rose. A single insult to the wrong person at a banquet could spark a vendetta. A misjudged land dispute could drag you into a feud. A poorly timed joke at court could put your head on the chopping block. Or still, your wealth itself made people want to see you fall. The more you had, the more others wanted to take it from you. A rival could spread rumors about your loyalty, accuse you of heresy, or bribe someone in the king's inner circle to whisper poison in his ear. Suddenly, your estate was under investigation. Your title was questioned. Your land was seized pending inquiry. Your family was cast into disgrace. And it all could begin with one careless comment or a moment of overconfidence. Court life was the most dangerous arena of all. The king's favor was a prize everyone coveted, but few held for long. Flatter him too much, and others would call you a sycophant. Disagree with him once, and you risked being labeled disloyal. Even a feast you hosted could backfire if it was too lavish. The king might feel upstaged. Too modest, and you'd seem stingy. Politics at court wasn't about winning battles. It was about surviving them. Then there was the church. In a world where faith governed life and law, even the wealthiest noble could be brought low by bishops. Disapproval. One hint of heretical thought could destroy your reputation. If your donations to the church were seen as insufficient, you might be accused of greed. If you were too generous to the wrong order, rivals might whisper that you were trying to buy absolution for some hidden sin. And if your enemies managed to convince the clergy that your soul was blackened by ambition or vice, you could find yourself excommunicated. That meant social death, your lands unprotected, your vassals released from loyalty. Your name cursed from the pulpit. Merchants fared no better. While they could rise to incredible heights of wealth, they walked an even finer line. Nobles often despised them for having money without bloodline. One financial misstep, a bad shipment, a failed deal, an accusation of usury could bring down an entire trading empire. If a merchant backed the wrong political faction or refused to loan money to the wrong noble, he could find his shops burned, his warehouses looted, and his name dragged through the mud. And if the king decided he needed funds, a rich merchant was often the first target for sudden taxation or arrest under trumped-up charges. For women of wealth, the tightrope was even narrower. A noblewoman's honor was everything. One unchaperoned walk in the garden with a male guest could spark rumors. A friendly letter could be misread as a scandalous confession. If her husband died and she inherited land, she was immediately swarmed by suitors, not for love, but for control of her wealth. A widow who hesitated too long to remarry might be accused of hoarding power. A wife who spoke too openly could be called impertinent. If she failed to produce an heir, she was cursed as barren. If she produced too many sons, she was seen as a threat to succession. A single misjudged alliance or misinterpreted glance could ruin her name, her fortune, and even her life. Even among your own household, one misstep could cost you everything. A trusted steward could embezzle your funds. A jealous cousin might accuse you of plotting treason. A servant could overhear something and repeat it out of context. In a time when gossip was a weapon and reputations were as fragile as glass, a simple misunderstanding could spiral into catastrophe. And the king himself was not beyond this. Monarchs had to navigate an impossibly delicate web of diplomacy, favoritism, family feuds, and papal authority. Kings could be overthrown by their own sons or poisoned by their own wives. A reckless decision like backing the wrong pope or launching a disastrous war could plunge a kingdom into chaos. Even a monarch had to tread carefully, aware that one wrong treaty or poorly chosen advisor could turn subjects against him and allies into enemies. Ruination came quickly and often violently. A nobleman who lost favor might find himself arrested without warning. His lands would be seized, his titles revoked, his family thrown into uncertainty. One day he would be dining in silks, the next he'd be in chains. His peers would distance themselves. His tenants might revolt. And the same courtiers who once begged for his attention would pretend they'd never known him. There was no such thing as a soft fall for the wealthy. When they fell, they shattered. The terror of making a single mistake created a climate of constant tension. Nobles consulted astrologers before making decisions. They kept spies in their own households. They bribed priests to pray for their reputation. They performed elaborate rituals of honor and hospitality to keep their social standing intact. And they taught their children not just etiquette, but paranoia, because it wasn't just your own mistakes that could ruin you. It was the mistakes of those around you. If your son got drunk and insulted a duke, it was your name that would suffer. If your brother backed a rebellion, your loyalty was called into question. If your daughter refused a politically arranged marriage, the alliance you'd worked years to build could collapse. Your entire family had to walk the tightrope with you every day without slipping. Being rich in medieval times was not a life of ease. It was a life of performance, a never-ending masquerade where one misstep could be your last. You had to be brave but not arrogant, generous but not wasteful, loyal but not naive, pious but not fanatical. You had to be everything at once and perfect at all of it, and you could never rest. Even in your sleep, you are not safe. Servants might conspire. Enemies might break through your castle gates. A bad dream might be seen as a divine warning. You woke up each day not with the comfort of wealth, but with the anxiety of how to keep it and how not to lose it all in an instant. So while peasants plowed fields and envied the rich behind their stone walls, they did not see the truth. They did not see the dagger hidden beneath the banquet table, or the eyes that followed every step. They did not hear the whispers in the hallways, or feel the cold fear of a misstep. To be rich in the medieval world was to dance on a blade's edge, and history is filled with the stories of those who danced too close to the edge. The proud earl who insulted a cardinal and lost everything. The merchant prince who defied a duke and was dragged through the streets. The queen who favored one courtier too much and found herself locked in a tower. The knight who chose the wrong side in a succession crisis and vanished from the chronicles entirely. One misstep. That was all it took. In the Middle Ages, fortune did not smile, it watched. And when the wealthy stumbled, it was not with sympathy, but with savage glee. So now that you've stepped inside the stone walls of medieval luxury, do you still think you'd want to be rich back then? The silk robes, the grand feasts, the castles, they all sound impressive from a distance. But once you get close, once you live it, the shine wears off quickly. Because in the Middle Ages, wealth didn't protect you. It exposed you. It exposed you to enemies who smiled at you during banquets and plotted behind your back. To family members who saw your inheritance not as a legacy, but as a prize worth killing for. To kings and queens who could strip you of everything with a single signature, and to the church, which could brand you a heretic just for owning too much land or asking the wrong question. Being rich wasn't freedom. It was pressure. You had to marry who they told you to marry, support the causes they demanded, and stay one step ahead of everyone who wanted your power for themselves. And if you ever slipped just once, you could find yourself rotting in a dungeon, exiled, in disgrace, or dead from something as simple as the wrong person serving your wine. Even in death, you weren't safe. Your passing could trigger a violent inheritance war. Your children could turn on each other. Your land could be seized. Your name could be erased or vilified, all because your fortune was too tempting to leave a lone dot. So while the peasants broke their backs in the fields, they at least knew who their enemies were: hunger, taxes, winter. But the rich, their enemies, sat beside them at the table, wore their family crest, and sometimes even shared their bed. The truth is, medieval wealth wasn't about enjoying life. It was about surviving it. And the richer you were, the harder it was to hold on to what you had. No CCTV, no lawyers, no fairness, just whispered rumors, sharpened daggers, and alliances that could dissolve in a heartbeat dot. So maybe the worst thing about being rich in medieval times wasn't the poison, the paranoia, or the constant fear of betrayal. Maybe it was the crushing realization that no matter how high you climbed, you were always just one misstep away from losing it all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of medieval life and discovering the dark side of wealth, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which medieval reality surprised you the most. And remember, in the Middle Ages, the throne wasn't the safest seat in the house. It was the most dangerous one.